Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 26, in which our party takes the express train on the Pacific Railroad. From ocean to ocean, so say the Americans, and these four words ought to be a general name of the Grand Trunk which traverses the United States in the greatest breadth. But in reality, the Pacific Railroad is divided into two distinct parts, the Central Pacific from San Francisco to Ogden, and the Union Pacific from Ogden to Omaha. Omaha. In that point, five distinct lines meet, which Omaha in frequent communications with New York. New York and San Francisco are therefore now united by an uninterrupted metal ribbon measuring not less than 3,786 miles. Between Omaha and the Pacific, the railroad traverses a country still frequented by the Indians and wild animals, by the vast extent of territory which the Mormons commenced to colonize by 1845 after they were driven out of Illinois. Formerly, under the most favorable circumstances, it took 6 months to go from New York to San Francisco. Now it is done in 7 days. It was in 1862, notwithstanding the opposition of Southern congressmen who wished a more southerly line, but the route of the railroad was fixed between the 41st and the 42nd parallel. President Lincoln, or so lamented in memory, himself fixed in the state of Nebraska the city of Omaha, in beginning of the new network. Work was commenced immediately and prosecuted with that American activity, and is neither slow nor routine-like. The rapidity of this construction did not in any way injure its thoroughness. On the prairies, the road progressed at a rate of a mile and a half per day. Locomotives moving over the rails laid yesterday, and carried the rails for the next day, and ran upon them in proportion as they were laid. The Pacific Railroad was thrown off several branches on its route in the states of Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, and Oregon, leaving Omaha and the left bank of the Platte River as far as the mouth of North Fork follows the South Fork, crosses Laramie Territory at the Wasatch Mountains, turns Salt Lake, arrives at Salt Lake, the capital of Mormons, buries itself in Tuala Valley, crosses the American Desert, and Cedar the Humboldt Mountains, the Humboldt River, the Sierra Nevada, and redescends via Sacramento to the Pacific. It is its grade, even crossing the Rocky Mountains, does not exceed 112 feet to the mile. Such was this long artery which the trains would pass over in 7 days, and which would permit the Honorable Phileas Fogg, at least he hoped so, to take the Liverpool steamer on the 11th at New York. The car occupied by Phileas Fogg was a sort of long omnibus, resting on two trucks, each with four wheels, which the ease of motion permits of going round short curves. There were no compartments inside, and two rows of seats placed on each side, perpendicular to the axle, and between which was reserved an aisle, leaving to the dressing room the others, in which was each car provided. Through the whole length of the train the cars communicated by platforms, and the passengers could move about from one end to the other of the train, which placed at their disposal palace, balcony, restaurant, and smoking cars. All that is wanting is a theatre car, but there will be some day. On the platforms, book news dealers were constantly circulating, dealing out their merchandise, and vendors of liquors, eatables, and cigars were not wanting in customers. The travelers left Oakland Station at 6 o'clock. It was already night, and cold and dreary, with an overcast, threatening snow. The train could not move with great rapidity, and counting on the stops, it did not run more than a speed which ought, however, to enable it to cross the United States in the fixed time. They talked but little in the car. Sleep soon overcame the passengers. Passepartout sat near the detective, and he did not speak to him. Since the late events, their relations had become somewhat cold, nor sympathy or intimacy. Fix had not changed his manner, but Passepartout had retained an extreme reserve, ready at the least suspicion to choke his old friend. An hour before the starting of the train, a fine snow commenced to fall, which fortunately could not delay the progress of the train, and through the windows nothing was seen but an immense white sheet. Against the clouds of steam from the locomotive looked grayish. At 8 o'clock, a steward entered the car and announced to the passengers that an hour for retiring had come. This was a sleeping car, in which a few minutes was transformed into a dormitory. The back seats were unfolded, the beds carefully packed away, were unrolled in an ingenious system, which were improvised for a few moments. Each passenger was soon at his disposal a comfortable bed, which thick curtains protected from all indiscreet looks, and the sheets were clean, the pillows soft. Nothing more could be done but to lie down and sleep, which everyone did, as if he had been comfortable cabin of a steamer. The train moved under a full head steam of the state of California, in the portion of the country San Francisco and Sacramento. The ground is not very hilly. This portion of the railroad, under the name the Central Pacific, originally had Sacramento for its starting point, went towards the east to meet that starting from Oahu in San Francisco to the capital of California, and the line ran directly to northeast along the American River, which empties from San Pablo Bay. The 120 miles included these between two important cities which were accomplished in 6 hours, and towards midnight, when they were getting to their first sleep, the travelers passed through Sacramento. They saw nothing of that large city and the seat of the state government of California, nor its fine wharves, its broad streets, and its splendid hotel and squares, nor its churches. Leaving Sacramento, the train had passed Junction, Rocklin, Auburn, and Colfax stations, plunged into Sierra Nevada. It was 7 o'clock, and in the morning, when Cisco Station was passed, an hour afterwards, the dormitory had become an ordinary car, and the passengers could get through the windows a glimpse of the picturesque views of this mountainous country. And the route of the train followed the windings of the Sierra. Here, clinging to the sides of the mountains, there suspended above a precipice, avoiding sharp angles by bowed curves, plunging into the narrow gorges from which seemed to be no exit. The locomotive, flashing fire, chased like an animal, and its large smoke pipe throwing out lurid lights. Its sharp bell, its cowcatcher, and extending out like a spur, mingled its shrieks and bellowings with the noise of torrents and cascades, entwined in the smokes of darks, and the branches of the firs. There were few or no tunnels or bridges on the route, and the railroad had turned the flank of the mountains, not seeking a straight line, the shortest route from one point to another, not doing violence to nature. About 9 o'clock, the train entered the state of Nevada through Carson Valley, which always fell in northeasterly direction, and at noon it left Reno, where passengers had a 20-minute for breakfast. From this point, the iron road, skirting from Humboldt River, passed a few miles from the north, then it bent to the east, and did not leave the stream until it reached the Humboldt Range, where the river takes its source nearly in the end of the state of Nevada. After breakfasting, Mr. Fogg, Miss Auda, and their companions took their seat again in the car. Phileas Fogg and the young woman, Fix and Passepartout, comfortably seated, looked at the varied country passing before their sight. Vast prairies, mountains whose profile were shown upon the horizon, the creeks tumbling down, a foaming mass of water, sometimes large herd of bison, gathering in the distance, appeared like a moving dam. These innumerable armies of grazing animals frequently oppose an insurmountable obstacle due to the passage of trains. Thousands of the animals have been moving on for hours due to close ranks across the railroad. The locomotive is then forced to stop and wait until the place is clear again. The same thing happened on this occasion. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a herd of 10 or 12,000 blocked the railroad, and the engine, having slackened its speed, tried to plunge its spur into the flank of the immense column, but had to stop before the impenetrable mass. They saw these buffaloes, as Americans improperly called them, moving with their steady gait, frequently bellowing terribly. They had a larger body than those of bulls in Europe, short-legged and tailed, and the projecting saddle forming a muscular bump. Horns separated at the base, and their heads, necks, and shoulders covered with long, shaggy hair. They, they could not think of stopping this moving mass, and when the bison could have adopted a course, nothing could swerve from it to modify it. There are torrents of living flesh which no dam could hold, and travellers scattered on the platform looked at this curious spectacle. Phileas Fogg, who ought to be the most in a hurry, had remained in his seat, and was waiting for philosophically until it should please the buffaloes to open a passage. Passepartout was furious at the delay caused by this mass of animals. He wanted to fire all revolvers at them. "What a country!" he cried. "Mere cattle stop trains, move along in procession without hurrying, if they did not impede travel. Parbleu! I would like to know if Mr. Fogg had foreseen this mischance in his programme, and what an engineer who dared not to rush his engine through this impeding mass of beasts. The engineer had not attempted to overcome the obstacle, and he acted wisely. He would undoubtedly have crushed the first buffaloes and stroked the cowcatcher, but as powerful as it was, the engine would have been stopped, and the train thrown off the track and wrecked. The best course, then, was to wait patiently, and to make up the lost time by an increase of speed of the train. The passage of the bison lasted 3 full hours. The road was not clear again until nightfall. At this moment the last ranks of the herd crossed the rails, and Willis first was disappearing below the southern horizon. It was then 8 o'clock when the train passed through the defiles of the Humboldt Range, and 9:30 when it entered Utah Territory, the region of Great Salt Lake, the curious Mormon country.